In my Zapdos video, I used footage like this for both Snorlax and Gengar's brief appearances. I received a bunch of comments asking what this game was, so here's your answer. This is Pokémon Type Wild, a fan-made Pokémon fighting game released online in 2006. The rumor surrounding it always was that it was made by one of the Pokémon anime's former animators, and I wouldn't be surprised if that turned out to be true. The animations in Type Wild look really smooth, with the impact of each attack feeling substantial. I've left a link in the pinned comment so you can download the game and try it for yourself, but going into it, you'll recognize that Type Wild is obviously unfinished. That's not a criticism of clunky gameplay or anything like that. The roster spot on the bottom right is just straight up empty. For a while, I thought that the Pokemon meant to fill that spot would be from Johto, as it's the only region from that time that isn't represented. Kanto has Gengar and Snorlax, Hoenn has 5 representatives, and the newest region at the time, Sinnoh, has 2 as well. A while ago, I found that the creator of the game was on Twitter, and surprisingly, runs one of the biggest Japanese Pokemon fan sites, Pokoshow. So I scanned through their tweets back then to see if there was any mention of Type Wild. Turns out, there was, and it revealed that Mewtwo was going to be the final Pokemon added before development stopped all those years ago. So yeah, no Johto. But Mewtwo is super cool, so fair enough. Type Wild is a 6-button fighting game, with 2 buttons for punches, 2 buttons for kicks, then an assist button, and a special button. There are 2 meters at the top of your health bar. The longer of the 2 is the normal super meter you'll find in 99% of 2D fighting games. I really like how the game labels your meter as power points, like in the Pokemon RPGs. It's a basic addition, but it makes the game feel more authentically Pokemon. You start off each match with 100 power points, the amount needed to do a light version of your finishing blow, the name given to this game's version of super moves. But before each match, you're given 4 options. This includes your choice to have 1 of 3 assists, or have no assist at all in exchange for 100 extra power points to start the match with. The assists, opening intros, and stages pack on the references in a way that's really charming. Gengar's stage is from the famous Tower of Terror episode, while 2 of its assists are callbacks to the Mystery Dungeon games. It's very easy to tell that this game was made by someone who loves the franchise, and it makes me like the game even more. Without getting into the nitty-gritty of the game's systems, I'll end this intro section with a quick look at each of the 9 original characters before going into which Pokemon I'd add if I could. Blaziken is this game's version of Ryu from Street Fighter. It's got an uppercut, a hurricane kick, and a projectile, the trio of moves that Ryu is famous for. The major addition to its kit is Fire Punch, similar to Ryu's Donkey Kick, but with the added benefit of having 1 hit worth of armor. While Combusken may seem like an odd inclusion with Blaziken already on the roster, the 2 feel very different to use. Combusken's version of Sky Uppercut slides on the ground as a low attack before shooting into the uppercut portion of the move. Its projectile, Fire Spin, covers vertical space as opposed to Blaziken's horizontal Flamethrower. Its final 2 specials surprised me, as they're both charge moves, blitzing at the opponent from different angles. Quick Attack shoots forward with a head-on charge, and Mega Kick sees Combusken leaping into the air, then coming down with a furious dive kick. Part of me feels that this spot should have gone to Quilava, just so that all the generations got repped. But I still dig how it shows that 2 Pokemon from the same evolution line can play very differently. Lucario feels like a strong rushdown fighter. If you've ever played Street Fighter III Second Impact, Lucario's like a cross between Sean and Yun. Its finishing blow, Close Combat, looks really similar to Sean's Super Art 3, along with having a 2-hit Shoryuken like Sean's Michael Jordan Uppercut. On the Yun side, Force Palm is Yun's Palm Strikes, and Lucario has the familiar Shoulder Attack as a command normal. Snorlax is your typical slow, big body character, complete with a command grab in Body Slam, and helpful approach options in Double Edge and Mega Punch. Snorlax is both the only Pokemon unable to dash, and the only Pokemon with 3 special moves, as everyone else has 4 like you'd see in the RPGs. I would add Yawn as its 4th special move, a non-damaging projectile that would put the opponent to sleep in 4 seconds if they didn't land a clean hit on Snorlax in that time. Swalot, the most peculiar inclusion by far, is a resource-based character with a pair of command grabs. By pressing both punch buttons, you use the move Stockpile, which can be stocked up to 3 times. You use these stocks on either the projectile Spit Up or the self-healing move Swallow. Not having any legs, it uses a pincer in its stomach for its kicks, which is why X-Scissor is one of its special moves. Swalot is my favorite character in the game. It's a great showing of the creativity that went into making Type Wild and adapting these Pokemon moves for a fighting game. Lopunny feels like a glass cannon. They're the only fighter with a double jump, and also have a damaging command jump in Bounce. Double Hit, Dizzy Punch, and the rest of their punch attacks all have really big hitboxes. I could see them being incredibly frustrating to fight. Gardevoir is one of 2 Pokemon with multiple finishing blows, the other being Lucario, and is a character I feel would be really good if this game was played competitively. They've got forward and backward teleports, a fireball, the ability to set an exploding ball at different distances on the screen with Future Sight, and a far-reaching command grab in Psychic. This is all before mentioning their finishing blows. Lucky Chant heals back a significant amount of health, while Imprison does damage and locks the opponent out of doing something. I'm not sure what that something is yet, but the game does put an X over the opponent's face when they get hit by it, so maybe special moves or possibly assists? Next, we've got Gengar, an amalgamation of different influences. Invincible dashes like Slayer, a charge projectile in Shadow Ball similar to Guile's Sonic Boom, and Poison Jab as a dashing punch like Yun. Sucker Punch is its other sorta normal special move, and it's really fun to use. Its last special move is Hypnosis. It puts the opponent to sleep like in the mainline games, and is necessary to do before you hit its finishing blow, Dream Eater. Last on the original roster is Breloom, the character I'd probably main. Breloom feels like a powerhouse, and the reach on some of its attacks is really nice. Seed Bomb is an interesting special move, with the heavy version rolling on the ground for a bit before exploding, as opposed to the light version which explodes in the air. If I had it my way, Type Wild would have been made into a proper first-party Nintendo game, and its creator given the funding and a team around them to go all the way with the many cool things this game attempts. What I've done for this video is construct a fantasy roster of Pokemon I would like to see added to the game if it ever got that first-party backing. We'll look at how each additional Pokemon would play and what their special moves would be. Aside from a few specific cases, I've stuck to only using moves that already exist in the video games and card game. Every region except for Hoenn and Paldea are included in this roster booster. Hoenn's left out because it already has 5 inclusions, and Paldea's left out because I haven't played Scarlet and Violet yet. So leave your ideas for Paldea region fighters in the comments below. Before we get going, let me explain how this video is going to be formatted visually. The Pokemon I'm talking about will be in the top left. Its special moves and finishing blow will take up the bottom half of the screen. In the top right will be footage of other fighting games that resemble the moves I'm talking about the Pokémon having. The resemblance will only be from a visual perspective, so you might see a move do big damage in the footage when I'm talking about its counterpart doing low damage in Type Wild. All the games shown in the move footage will be listed in the description below if you want to check them out. Starting things off is Dragonite, the original Dragon type, who I envision as being a rushdown fighter with a preference for playing in the mid-range, hitting hard and moving with above average quickness. Their special moves would be Extreme Speed, a wildly fast, hard-hitting command dash with the power of the button determining the distance. It can also be used backward and in the air. Sky Drop, a command grab that also works in the air. Now here we see our first move from the trading card game, Spiral Wind. This would be a mid-range tornado projectile, kinda like Mega Man's from Marvel vs. Capcom. It would have 3 different power levels, since its input would be quarter circle forward, plus punch and kick. So you could go both light buttons, both heavy buttons, or one light and one heavy button. Its fourth and final special move would be a Dragon-type staple in Dragon Claw. This would be Dragonite's Shoryuken, and it could have an optional second hit where it flips and strikes with its tail. Its finishing blow would be Outrage, though I'm not sure if, in this game, it should be a power-up install super or just a high-damaging mega move. If it is an install, this could finally give us a Mega Dragonite, and give this game its own exclusive Pokémon, like how Pokken Tournament has Shadow Mewtwo. With Dragonite done, Tentacruel is up next. In Type Wild, it would emulate its play in competitive single battles, being a surprisingly durable defensive fighter. Here, Tentacruel would play a keep-away game with its long tentacle normal attacks, and also make use of them by having a deceptively long command grab in Constrict. Tentacruel can further keep you at a distance with Scald, a water stream projectile that has a lot of pushback and will burn on counter hit. But the fun doesn't stop there, as it can also lower its opponent's damage output with Venom Drench, poison them with Toxic, and restore its own health with its finishing blow, Aqua Ring. I would love to see Tentacruel introduced alongside a Vermilion Harbor stage, where you fight in an underwater dome with other oceanic Pokemon in the background. The last Kanto Pokemon I'd add to Type Wild would be Raichu, my preferred electric mouse. The best way to describe my vision for Raichu would be annoying, as it would use its high speed and long tail normals in combination with unique special attacks to frustrate its opponents. For that reason, they were difficult to find comparable fighting game moves to show, but I tried my best. Raichu's specials would include Fake Out, which must be used in the first 15 seconds of a match. It would have almost instant startup, and there has to be something about this move that doesn't just let the opponent play keep away for the first 15 seconds before going into their normal game plan. Making the move unblockable seems like the simplest way to accomplish that goal, but that also feels like it's baiting a lot of unforeseen negative consequences from a balance perspective. Next up is Thunder Wave, which would see Raichu tossing an electric wave at the opponent that paralyzes them for a few seconds. The light version would go horizontal like a normal projectile, while the heavy version would shoot up at a diagonal angle to catch airborne opponents. Now we get to Encore. Like Gengar's Hypnosis, this would be a proximity special that must be done relatively close. It would force the opponent to repeat their last move 3 times before they can use another attack. Any button they press will result in the Encore move coming out. Raichu's last special move would be Thunderbolt, because you can't have a Pikachu line member without it. This would be Raichu's one special move that does decent damage. Its input would be a Shoryuken input with any of the 4 attack buttons. The punch variants would hit closer, while the kick variants would hit further away, giving it a variety of uses. Its finishing blow would be another Pikachu line staple, Volt Tackle, which would do really good damage and come with a cool visual. Now we can move on to actually getting some Johto Pokemon in this game. Here's one I had a lot of fun with, Ledian, who I imagine as a low damage hit and run character with great mobility, including both a double jump and an air dash. No Pokemon on the original Type Wild roster has both of those movement options. To compensate for its normally low damage in another way, Ledian can boost the power of its next attack by going for Swords Dance, which can be cancelled into off the majority of its moves. Looking at its other special moves, we'll start with Comet Punch, a fast, low damage poke that covers 1/3 of the screen distance-wise, done by doing a quarter circle forward input with either punch button. As a longer range version of Comet Punch, U-turn would go full screen. If Ledian hits a wall instead of the opponent, Ledian would stick to the wall and have the option of either shooting back at the opponent at one of 3 angles with a direction plus punch, or dropping off the wall with either kick button. Its last special move would be Air Cutter, an air-only projectile. This would make it the first time that anyone in any version of competitive Pokemon has had a reason to use Air Cutter. I struggled to come up with what Ledian's finishing blow should be, as all of its other moves were picked pretty easily. It's tempting to just slap a high damage move on a low damage fighter, so that's what I'm doing. Give it Bug Bite as a dash up unblockable super, though one that can be jumped out of if you went for it from too far away. Johto was a lot of fun for me to conceptualize ideas for. A bunch of my favorites come from Generation 2, including a key piece on many of my favorite competitive teams, Azumarill. Azumarill's gonna be a bulky, up-close brawler. To compensate for its otherwise limited mobility, it'll have Aqua Jet as a damaging command dash. When it gets in, it'll have the option to go for Play Rough, a command grab with a special animation like it has in the mainline games, or Waterfall, a hard-hitting tackle that darts forward a short distance. Using the heavy version of Waterfall would have Azumarill shoot upward into the air a little bit, which, with upper body invincibility on the move, would make it a decent anti-air. The last special move is one that some might expect to be its finishing blow, but I think Belly Drum would work better as a risk that you can take at any point in the match. Belly Drum would do exactly what it does in the normal games. Cost Azumarill half of its health in exchange for quadrupling its physical attack, or in this case, its moves that make contact. The catch here is that the way it removes health would actually be like Super Fang, in that, regardless of its current health, it removes 50% of it. You could theoretically go for Belly Drum when you only have 2 points of health left and try to guts it out with a magic pixel. Using it at a single point of health left would cost you nothing. Its finishing blow would actually come from the trading card game in the form of Bubble Shower. This would be a weak projectile in terms of raw damage, but would also paralyze the opponent for a substantial amount of time, allowing Azumarill to set up whatever it wants, like the start of a combo or going for Belly Drum. Now we get to the king of the castle, Tyranitar. Gen 2's resident kaiju monster would be a beefy mid-range powerhouse. My version of Tyranitar wants to keep you at a very specific distance, and its special moves would work toward achieving that goal. Stone Edge would be an upward burst of stones similar to Gaara's sand pistons from the Naruto Clash games. Done by doing half circle back plus punch, the light and heavy versions would do the same damage but shoot out at different spots on the floor. The heavy version would come out at the mid-range spot that Tyranitar loves, while the light version would be a get off of me up close reversal option. If you want to get close to Tyranitar, you're going to have to keep an eye out for stealth rocks. which would hurt any opponent that walks on them and would last until they are forcibly removed. Iron Tail and Ice Beam would be what Tyranitar uses once it's gotten you into its sweet spot. They're self-explanatory in terms of what they do, so I don't feel the need to say more. Its finishing blow would be Crunch, because I feel like it needed to have a Dark-type attack. The last Johto edition was famously a menace in the VGCs and other doubles formats throughout the 4th, 5th, and 6th generations, along with being the best evolution of Tyrogue. Hitmontop is very much like Ledian in that I had a lot of fun coming up with its moves. Hitmontop would be a mid-range pest with 50/50s and a guard break who would visually resemble Eddie from Tekken, as they are both users of Capoeira. Let's start with its signature move, Triple Kick. I imagine this acting like Ibuki's spinning kicks from Street Fighter, with the option to go low after the first hit. But unlike Ibuki's normal versions, and exactly like her EX versions, Hitmontop would be able to do all 3 kicks even if it went low on the second one. As for its guard break, this would come in the form of Feint. This move would be minus in terms of frame data on hit and do 0 damage, but it would have a ton of plus frames and do a little bit of damage if it hit your opponent while they were blocking. This move is Feast or Famine. Either you land it, break their guard, and take advantage of all those plus frames, or you do 0 damage and are left wide open for a big combo. Its most damaging special move would be Drill Run, which will have some added utility when facing a future entry on this list later in the video. When facing Tyranitar and other Pokemon that have the option to set field conditions, Hitmontop could use Rapid Spin to get rid of them. Rapid Spin would also remove any stat modifiers and status conditions, along with boosting Hitmontop's mobility for a short time. Its finishing blow would be Rolling Kick, which would probably look similar to a Dawn's Jaguar Revolver from Street Fighter. Now, I know I said I wasn't going to add any more Hoenn Pokemon, but it's my favorite region, so I at least wanted to give it something in this video. This section is being added while the video is being edited, so these ideas are much less thought out than the rest of them. Here are a few ideas for other Hoenn additions. Nuzleaf, my first favorite Pokemon. With all of its Pokédex entries mentioning it playing a grass flute, perhaps letting it alter elements of play with moves like Grass Whistle and Perish Song could make it an interesting character to both use and fight. Hariyama. Our sumo fighter, Hariyama gives me the chance to use a move that I had tied up with Diggersby before realizing that Lopunny had everything I intended to give it except this move. Sand Attack would now be a reference to the act of throwing salt before a sumo match. I'd want Hariyama to be the quickest of the big body characters, and toy with the idea of how a sumo-based fighter can function. Lastly, here's an idea for the whole Salamence line. With other Pokemon having flying capabilities on this roster that I'll mention later, I had an idea for Salamence to work up to being able to fly itself, as is the case with its pre-evolved form, Bagon. Pokédex entries say how Bagon's desire to fly was so great that it literally forced a change in its own genetics to give it wings. The idea here would be to have the player start out as a Bagon, and through accomplishing different things throughout battle, they would evolve into a Shelgon and then later a Salamence. It's Pokemon. Having evolution as part of a fighter just makes sense. It would also make sense to include something in the options menu that allows players to turn off evolution and pick their own form if they want to exclusively play as one of the 3 stages. That'll do it for Hoenn. With Lopunny and Lucario already in the game, I wanted to add one last Sinnoh Pokemon, but trouble came when Dragonite covered most of what you'd normally expect this next Pokemon to play like, so I had to take a different approach. Instead of being a fast, offensive titan, Garchomp would now be a defensive brawler, able to play some decent keep away. It would also have an ability install that activates when pressing all 4 attack buttons, but costs 150 power points. Rough Skin is an ability that Garchomp runs in competitive play to tack on extra damage to any Pokemon making direct contact with it, and that's exactly how I would want it to function in Type Wild. Any fighter that touches Garchomp will be hurt for doing so, even if Garchomp blocks their attack. As for its special moves, I started off with Incinerate. You basically never see Garchomp run it in competitive, but I chose this move specifically for its low damage and added property. In Type Wild, Incinerate would be a fast but short-range burst that would burn away some of the opponent's power points on hit and block, along with doing damage. With Dragonite already having Dragon Claw and Outrage, I was limited in terms of physical Dragon-type attacks that I could use for Garchomp. I settled on Dual Chop as a lower damage option that would help Garchomp keep its opponents at a distance with heavy pushback. I also gave it Dragon Tail to give it a Dragon-type special move that does some good damage. Dragon Tail would also cause a wall bounce or wall splat at closer ranges, with the wall reaction being dependent on which button you press. Earthquake was another signature Garchomp move I already had wrapped up with another Pokemon, so I went with Dig, allowing Garchomp to zoom across the screen and pop up for some damage. Like Eddie's Break the Law special, for example, Garchomp would be able to extend its stay underground by keeping its attack button held. Here's where Hitmontop's Drill Run would be a powerful tool. When used while Garchomp is underground, Drill Run would do double damage and force Garchomp to resurface. Garchomp's finishing blow would be Dragon Rush, which I imagine as a horribly busted reversal super going almost full screen in an instant and having full body invincibility. Now we get to Generation 5 and the Pokemon that will be representing Unova. We'll start with Hydreigon, who I wrote in my notes as being a fuck you zoner. But seriously, I love Hydreigon and would want it to be really good, so I made it terribly oppressive. It has a quartet of fierce projectiles that all do different things. We'll start with Dark Pulse. As its shortest range projectile, it would cover the same amount of space as Garchomp's Dual Chop. Then we've got Fire Blast, a charge projectile that would send out the move's signature flaming logo. The light version would be faster but shorter, able to be jumped over normally. The heavy version would be slower but must be super jumped over. Earth Power would be similar to Tyranitar's Stone Edge in terms of looks, but must be blocked low and would launch on counter hit. Lastly, we've got Dragon Pulse, which looks just like Blaziken's Flamethrower, but purple and gray in color. Its finishing blow would be the famous Draco Meteor, which, well, you die. I could see this version of Hydreigon being Type Wild's only banned fighter, unless Cryogonal is such a brutal counterplay. Yeah, Cryogonal's on the roster, and its answer to Hydreigon would be its special move Magic Coat, which would bounce projectiles back at their user. This would work on projectiles which have already been deflected by Magic Coat, because I want to see two Cryogonals playing Icicle Spear Ping Pong. Icicle Spear would be a multi-hit projectile just like it is in the normal games. The power of the button would change the arc of the projectile. Its other special moves come from Guilty Gear's Baiken. Aurora Beam would be a mid-range projectile beam that tethers the opponent to Cryogonal on hit, while Mirror Coat would be its version of alpha counters. While blocking, do a half circle forward plus any of your attack buttons to get a different alpha counter. Its finishing blow would be Blizzard, a simple full screen super that does a lot of damage. Now we get to the reason Garchomp can't have Earthquake. Because it belongs to Golurk. While doing solid damage, Earthquake's main purpose for Golurk would be to knock down the opponent for a significant amount of time and allow this slow fighter a chance to close in on them, like Potemkin's Headslide. Its emulation of Potemkin's Hammerfall ironically isn't Hammer Arm, another special move I gave to Golurk. Hammer Arm would cover 75% of the screen with a downward swinging bash, and lower Golurk's already putrid speed stat for a time. Golurk's actual answer to Hammerfall would be Shadow Punch, which would go through all attacks except lows. Fly would be its fourth special move, and would work like Sentinel's Fly in the Marvel vs. Capcom games, but be hindered just like Golurk's other aspects of movement when dealing with the drawbacks of Hammer Arm. Ancient Power would be its finishing blow. I'd want a really cool cinematic super that speaks to Golurk's supposed origins as a machine made by humans to help them in ancient times. If you got to the end of my Zapdos video, you probably saw this next one coming. Before we leave Unova, I want to talk about my absolute favorite Pokemon, Bisharp. Bisharp wants to play up close and in your face, and does so in a variety of punishing ways. Ironhead keeps things simple with being a blunt head bash that does good damage. The heavy version would also cause a hard knockdown. Then we've got Knockoff, which does below average damage, but also knocks off 15% of the opponent's meter on hit. If your opponent is trying to escape, go for Pursuit, as its power will double if the enemy is backdashing or jumping away. But crucially, it will not get the damage boost if the enemy is walking backward. Because walking backward is slower than backdashing, the enemy will likely be kept in range of other options by the threat of Pursuit. Its frame data should also be altered given opportune and inopportune uses. Bisharp's final special move is Sucker Punch. To make it different from Gengar's Sucker Punch, Bisharp's version will function as a command parry that catches attacks, then sees Bisharp bolt to the opponent with a nasty strike. This would also work on projectiles, making Bisharp another potential check to Hydreigon. Its finishing blow would be Night Slash, where the screen would go all black and Bisharp would zoom in to land a massive hit on its opponent. Moving on to Generation 6, Kalos gave me fits. Two Pokemon got figured out really easily, but it was finding a third Kalos rep that was a rough process. The obvious play would be to go with Greninja, and maybe this is just me being a hipster, but I wasn't feeling it. The same goes for other obvious inclusions like Pangoro and Chestnut, both of whom I didn't think would add anything the roster didn't already have in its other fighting types. I had Diggersby sorta figured out, but then played Type Wild with more than just Gengar, and realized Lopunny does 95% of what I'd want Diggersby to do. You'll see who I went with in the end, but first, let's start off with the two Generation 6 Pokemon that were easy to figure out. Trevenant came together pretty quickly. I'd have it function as a slow, self-healing fighter that can sometimes be incredibly stationary. Ingrain would be the reason for that. Trevenant would root itself in place and restore health over time while losing the ability to walk or jump, though it will still be able to block in both directions. To get out of Ingrain, Trevenant would either have to spend 50 power points by doing a quarter circle forward plus the special button, or use Wood Hammer, which would have it fall forward onto the opponent and do some good damage. To break Trevenant out of Ingrain themselves, the opponent would have to land 5 consecutive hits. Trevenant's other healing option would be Hornleech, which would do decent damage and restore to Trevenant a percentage of the damage it dealt to the opponent. Its fourth special move would be Hex. This would be a low damage projectile that curses the opponent, doing chip damage until they break the curse by hitting Trevenant. Its finishing blow would be Forest's Curse, my favorite finishing blow on the whole roster. It would be a cinematic super that sees the opponent getting lost in a forest, and the forest then going up in flames. Like the Tsukiyomi from Naruto, this would all occur in the opponent's head. In the spirit of Type Wild being full of references to different parts of Pokemon's history, the next fighter will be one that players never got to use. Seen in a key cutscene in Pokemon X and Y, but never released to the public, Eternal Flower Floette had fans going wild with theories, especially after a complete version was found within Pokemon X and Y's files, having vastly different stats from your normal Floette. I think it would be really cool if Type Wild was the game that finally let this Floette's story be explored. As a fighter, I'd want Floette to be the weakest member of the cast, even when including my Bagon idea, with it having the lowest damage output by far. Its special moves would be pretty basic. Vine Whip would be an unremarkable mid-range strike. Echoed Voice would be a decent projectile, with it getting more powerful on consecutive uses, but even at its most powerful, it's still doing less than Hydreigon's light button version of Dark Pulse. Worry Seed and Covet give it some annoyance potential, however. Worry Seed will cut the opponent off from using their assists and specials, while Covet will deal a small amount of damage while stealing a large amount of power points. The real threat from Eternal Flower Floette is its finishing blow, Light of Ruin, a full screen super that, on block, does insane chip damage, and is basically a one-touch kill if it hits. Those two were easy, but this last one flustered me for days trying to figure it out, and I still made a massive change to it right before recording this. A near complete reflection of how it works normally, Aegislash would be Type Wild's only stance character. The difference here is that it would manually change forms, unlike in the games where using any attacking move forces it to switch into sword form. Now here's how that would work in Type Wild. In sword form, it does triple the damage it would do in shield form. In shield form, it takes 1/3 the damage it would take in sword form. The one aspect I'd change is Aegislash's speed. In regular Pokemon games, Aegislash's speed doesn't change when it changes forms. But I think it would be really tough to have its sword form be both frail and as slow as its shield form, so let's say its overall mobility gets better as well. By default, it would begin the match in shield form, but pressing any of the attack buttons during introductions would change it to its sword form before the round begins. It would otherwise change forms by pressing both punch buttons or both kick buttons at the same time. There'd probably have to be a bit of balancing done to its frame data when switching stances, but that's for people much smarter than me to figure out later. The stances would share 2 special attacks and have 2 unique ones. The frame data on the shared specials would also have to be altered depending on the form. Let's look at the specials the stances would share first. Shadow Sneak would be a damaging command dash that can go in either direction, making it helpful on both offense and defense. Flash Cannon would be the stance's shared projectile. In shield form, it would be your normal beam projectile. Its range would shrink considerably in sword form, where it would function as a bursting get-off-of-me tool. Next we'll look at its sword form specials, starting with Sacred Sword. This would be a good mid-range tool that does impactful damage. But things get complicated when we look at Shadow Ball. This feels like a move that Aegislash should have, but I struggled mightily to figure out how to make it functionally different from Gengar's version. Gengar's Shadow Ball uses a charge input, which I think would also be useful in balancing this attack's power for Agi. Gengar can't enhance the power of its Shadow Ball by holding down the attack button before firing it, as opposed to Venom's Stinger Aim from Guilty Gear and Ryu's Denjin Hadoken from various versions of Street Fighter. But would adding that to Aegislash's version make this move broken? After some careful consideration and a whole lot of frustration, I've decided to not care about balance. So here's what Shadow Ball is going to be for Aegislash, a variation on Venom's Ball set. By doing quarter circle back plus any of the buttons, including the assist and special buttons, Aegislash will set a small Shadow Ball at different parts of the screen. The key difference between it and Venom's ball set is that Aegislash can only set one ball at a time, and that ball will only disappear when hit by the opponent. But the longer the ball stays on screen, the bigger and more powerful it becomes, even gaining its own active hitbox after a certain point. This makes it an interesting mix of both ball set and Stinger Aim. Now we get to the Shield Form special moves, which are thankfully easier to explain than Shadow Ball. Let's start off with Aegislash's signature move, King's Shield. A move only available while blocking, it would push the opponent back and switch Aegislash into Sword Form. Yes, I do realize this is the exact opposite way the move works in the Pokemon RPGs. But those aren't fighting games, so I'm adapting the move to fit in a fighting game. Its other Shield Form special move would come from the trading card game in the form of Sonic Edge. I think this could be used as some sort of disc attack, where Shield Form Aegislash would flatten out horizontally, then spin to create sharp discs of wind. This projectile would have shorter range compared to the Shield Form version of Flash Cannon, but the discs would hold their place on screen for a period of time with a floating hitbox. I'm going for something like what Guilty Gear has with Milia's Tandem Top Special. Its finishing blow would be another move from the TCG, Draining Blade, which I think I have a good idea for. When used in Shield Form, it does very little damage, but heals back a lot of health. When used in Sword Form, it's the opposite. A lot of damage, but very little recovery. With that exhaustion out of the way, we enter Alola adding only the second starter line to Type Wild with Decidueye. This is another Pokemon I see as being a big threat to other members of the roster, with it being good at all ranges and having some tricks up its sleeve, or in its quiver. Decidueye wants to keep you at a distance, but has no trouble slugging it out up close. It would have bow and arrow attacks as command normals, like Mina from the Samurai Showdown series, and it would also have 2 bow and arrow based special moves. Spirit Shackle is an exclusive move to Decidueye in the mainline games and fits great into a fighting game setting. In the RPGs, this move does good damage and prevents the target from leaving battle, so here's how I translate that into a fighting game. Anyone hit by Spirit Shackle can't dash or jump for about 15 seconds, but the move would do 1/4 the damage a typical projectile in this game does to compensate for having such an impactful secondary effect. Its other arrow-based special move is one I made up. Ancient arrows would look similar to Mina's bow heart attacks and serve as a reference to Decidueye's Hisuian form having a signature move called Triple Arrows. Its other 2 special moves would be Brave Bird and Leaf Blade. Brave Bird would be a Shoryuken with some backswing to it as Decidueye rounds back down to the ground. Its forward movement would be quite short, however. Leaf Blade would be a strong strike that works well in the mid-range. Its finishing blow would obviously be Sinister Arrow Raid, Decidueye's signature Z move from Pokemon Sun and Moon. Now we get to the only legendary Pokemon to make the cut for this video, because I seriously didn't like the majority of Alola Pokemon when considering roster spots. In my ideal world, legendary Pokemon would be boss characters in Type Wild that you'd then have to unlock, but here we are. Thanks, Alola. Tapu Koko would be a jack of all trades with the ability to fight at any range well, but without being exceptional at any one spot on the floor. Its only major advantage over most of the cast is its speed, which, in tandem with its decent bulk, would make it a surprisingly annoying combatant to take down. No matter where it is on the battlefield, Tapu Koko has good answers, and can get to where it wants to be extremely quickly. Now let's look at its special moves, beginning with Dazzling Gleam. This would be pretty similar to Dr. Doom's Sparkler attack in looks, and like that move, it can be done both on the ground and in the air. I'm thinking this move would have lower damage than the rest of Tapu Koko's special moves, and mainly be used as a defensive tool. Next we'll look at Nature's Madness, the signature move of all 4 of Alola's Tapu deities. This would be a grounded projectile command grab like Axel's Rashosen from Guilty Gear. After exploding, the opponent would then glow for a period of time, meaning that Tapu Koko's next hit would do 30% more damage to them. Feeling the need to give it an electric type move, I went with Wild Charge. Tapu Koko would hurl its electrified body at the opponent with reckless abandon, knocking them down but also taking minor recoil damage itself. The move would have full body armor for 2 hits, and, critically, Tapu Koko would not take recoil damage if it was hit during the move. Its last special move would be Aerial Ace, a fierce point-blank slash with Tapu Koko's beak. Its finishing blow would be Guardian of Alola, a 1-to-1 copy of how it looks in the normal Pokemon games. Our last Alolan Pokemon is Mudsdale, a Them's Fightin' Herds inspired character because I could not find inspiration in any other Gen 7 Pokemon that would be different from what I already have. It was one of Mudsdale's Pokédex entries that gave me a little idea, so I'll take it to meet the minimum 3 Pokemon per generation rule I set for this project. Its entry in Pokemon Sun says, it spits a mud that provides resistance to both wind and rain, so the walls of old houses were often coated with it. That at least gives me an idea for a gimmick. Said gimmick would come in the form of Mudshot, a move it surprisingly couldn't learn until the generation following its debut, despite always being able to learn both Mud Bomb and Mud Slap. But we're going with Mudshot over those other 2 because in the mainline games, it has the secondary effect I'd want for Mudsdale's gimmick in Type Wild. In those games, Mudshot always lowers the opponent's speed, and here it would also lower their jump arc. This will help Mudsdale as it's going to be one of the game's slowest fighters. Which makes sense since it's one of the 50 slowest fully evolved Pokemon in the regular games. On the inverse, Mudsdale would be one of the game's bulkiest Pokemon. Every Pokédex entry for it speaks of it having absurd degrees of endurance, and some also mention high pain tolerance. Mudsdale's next special move would be its signature move from the mainline games, High Horsepower. Mudsdale would turn around and shoot its back legs out for hard damage. Hitting high, the move can be ducked under, but would also make for a good anti-air, along with wall bouncing on counter hit. For those trying to duck under High Horsepower, Mudsdale could use its overhead special move, Stomp, to punish them. It would also counter Garchomps that are using Dig. Its last special move would be Vigorous Dash, another trading card game exclusive move. This would be a damaging command dash that has a few hits of armor, helping Mudsdale's approach options. Mudsdale's finishing blow would be Fissure. It's not the one-hit KO move it is in the regular games, but it would still be an extremely damaging super. We're finishing things off with Galar, and starting with Mr. Rime, a joke character that packs a surprising punch. Equipped with pretty good movement that speaks to its inspiration of actors that did similar acrobatics, Mr. Rime would have an SNK-esque short hop instead of a standard jump, along with a custom air parry that, if failed, has Rime stumbling comedically upon landing and leaves it very open to a counterattack. Before Decidueye's Ancient Arrows, Mr. Rime's Slapstick Humor special was the first custom move I imagined for this game. Mr. Rime would smack his opponent with his cane. The move would have a second hit that can be done within a tight, but not frame-perfect window that sees Rime knocking his opponent to the ground and laughing at them. The extension would of course be called Insult to Injury. Staying with the showbiz motif, Rime's Triple Axle special would see it tap dancing with great sound effects. This move would be a multi-hit low that can be cancelled after the first hit. I didn't realize until midway through recording the video, but Galarian Mr. Mime is known as the dancing Pokemon and has tap dancing mentioned in one of its Galar Pokédex entries, so this move fits even better than I originally thought. Its next two specials would further call back to its life as a mime before it took up a life of rhyme. Mimic would copy the opponent's last used special move into Rime's moveset. Regardless of the move's original input, Rime would be able to do it with Mimic's input, which would be quarter circle forward plus punch. Then we have Barrier, which is fitting because the original Mr. Mime is known as the Barrier Pokemon. Doing a half circle back motion input while pressing all 4 attack buttons would cause Mr. Rime to create an Aegis Reflector-like screen. This would be Rime's projectile in a sense. Wherever he is, the moves Rime does would come out normally, along with a mirrored version of them reaching out through the barrier, thus increasing his potential range and also probably giving him some nasty unblockable setups like Urian. The side of the barrier the attacks come out on would be determined by the user holding either the assist button or the special button. Mr. Rime's finishing blow would be Wonder Room. The battlefield becomes a black and white movie screen with one of 3 films playing out, all of which result in the same amount of damage being done to Rime's opponent. One of the scenes would have to be a play on this famous Buster Keaton clip that I will link in the description below out of fear of being copyright striked. Next up is Sandaconda. After really liking what I got out of Mudsdale, it made me more open to considering another non-humanoid Pokemon for a roster spot. Let's hop right into its list of special moves, starting with Scorching Sands. Sandaconda would blast sand out of its nose so fast as to burn the opponent, meaning this would burn on counter hit too. It would have a special meter for its sand amount, which would lower by 25% every time it uses the move, weakening its power. Sandaconda would restore its sand amount by moving forward, and if it ever runs out of sand, as its dex entry says, Sandaconda will become disheartened. In Type Wild, this would cause it to glare at the player instead of doing anything for 5 in-game seconds. Next up are a pair of special moves that remind us that we're playing as a snake. Coil would raise Sandaconda's defense, and in accordance with its dex entries, would also increase the power and range of Scorching Sands. The defense buffs would be able to be stacked, while the power increase to Scorching Sands would not. Then we've got Constrict. I mean, it's an anaconda. It would only make sense to have this as one of its moves. You'd think. Unless you were Game Freak, who have never given Sandaconda access to this move, despite letting a pair of balloons learn it. Like with Tentacruel, this would be a command grab. Going for Coil during the grab animation would give you Coil's buffs and add damage to your current Constrict attack. Its last special move would be Sandstorm, a field effect that does chip damage to the opponent. It would normally last 20 seconds, but will end immediately if Sandaconda is hit 3 times or if Hitmontop goes for Rapid Spin. Sandstorm would not count as a projectile, so it cannot be reversed by Cryogonal's Magic Coat or punished by Bisharp's Sucker Punch. Sandstorm would also shorten the range of opponents' projectiles while increasing the range of Scorching Sands. Its finishing blow would be Sand Tomb. Sandaconda engulfs its opponents in a storm of sand, whipping them up into the air before burying them deep underground. We finish things off with another one of my favorite Pokemon, Hatterene. I didn't know this until I worked on the video, but Hatterene's dex entries are terrifying. It is described as remorseless and very quick to act on its anger. Hatterene will be one of Type Wild's slower fighters, not because it can't move fast, but because it's so confident that you can't do anything to harm it. At least, that's how I justify it having a low base speed stat in the mainline games and remaining slow in Type Wild. Its walk cycle would have to resemble that of Slayer from Guilty Gear. Being a menace, its first 2 special moves would be a direct reference to its Pokémon Scarlet Pokédex entry. It states that Hat uses a Psychic Beam to knock its opponents out, and then slashes them with claws enhanced by psychic powers. To match that description, Psybeam would be a projectile that does solid damage and also briefly paralyzes the opponent. At close range, you can instantly follow up with Psycho Cut, which would also be a special move on its own and function similarly to Decidueye's Leaf Blade. I wanted Hatterene's remaining special moves to push the idea that it is extremely cocky and doesn't view the opponent as a threat, only as a prey it wants to toy with. Play Nice would be a very low damaging command grab that lowers the target's defense for a set amount of time, whatever would be deemed as impactful by this game's standards. The defense drops can be stacked. Then we have Disarming Voice, another low damaging attack, this time in the form of a projectile. It would lower the target's damage output for the same amount of time as Play Nice does to its defense, and can also be stacked. But the biggest show of arrogance would be Hatterene having the only finishing blow that neither does damage to the opponent nor heals itself. Magic Powder is Hatterene's signature move in the normal games, but I'm going to change its properties to fit a fighting game. Like, way more than I normally have up to this point. In the mainline Pokemon games, Magic Powder just makes the opponent a Psychic type. In Type Wild, I'd want this move to disorient the opponent, as if Hatterene enjoys watching its prey struggle with losing control of its own body. Magic Powder would reverse the opponent's inputs. Up would be down, Heavy Punch would be Light Kick, etc. This could even extend to special move inputs with regard to how special moves are listed on the character select screen, meaning that the first listed special move would have its motion input swapped with the 4th listed special move. Having now said that out loud, it sounds really mean and excessive given the buttons and directions already being reversed, which would fit Hatterene's character perfectly. And there we have it. If Type Wild ever got an official release, this is what I'd want its roster to look like. I'm outsourcing ideas for Generation 9 Pokemon to the comments section. If you have any, tell me as much. Aside from that, the question of the video is going to be, of any Pokemon on the original roster or my expanded ideas, who would be your main fighter in Type Wild? I'm having to record this section right as I was about to be done editing the video because I just realized I didn't give an answer of my own. I'd probably go with either Tentacruel, Raichu, Decidueye, or Hatterene. When trying to pick a main in a fighting game, one of the biggest selling points for me is their ability to annoy my opponent. They don't even have to be all that good otherwise. If my opponent wins, I want that win to be as unfun as possible, and I think those 4 Pokemon would be really good at that. Oh, and before we go, here are a bunch of other Pokemon I considered adding to this video, but either couldn't make room for, or didn't have enough of an idea for. I'm thinking about making a few shorter follow-up videos to this one, where I expand the roster ideas further by looking at some of these Pokemon that originally missed the cut. To any of you who have gotten this far into the video, thanks for sticking around. Anyways, peace.